aborted your first child?
Two.
Two?
He begged me to. I did what he wanted.
This was with Nelson.
He did. My first husband, he did me a great favor, really.
She won 2 Academy Awards. She sued a major Hollywood studio and lost in court, but won in reputation. She played every shade of woman the screen could hold. The tragic, the monstrous, the pitiable, the magnificent. And she did it across 6 decades without ever quite becoming ordinary. But off-screen, Bette Davis lived 4 marriages, each one more dramatic than the last. A husband who divorced her for reading too many books. A husband who died mysteriously on a Hollywood sidewalk. A husband who was violent and sleeping with the nanny. And a final husband whose relationship with her was one of the most combustible in Hollywood history. 4 men. 4 different versions of what a marriage can cost a woman who refuses to make the career smaller to fit the marriage bigger. This is that story. Lowell, Massachusetts, and the woman who would not be reduced. Ruth Elizabeth Davis was born on April 5, 1908, in Lowell, Massachusetts, the older of 2 daughters of Harlow Merrill Davis, a patent attorney, and Ruth Augusta Favor Davis, a woman of considerable determination and practical resourcefulness, whose influence on her daughters' lives would prove to be the most shaping force either of them encountered. Harlow Davis was not a man cut out for marriage or fatherhood in the ongoing sense. He was professionally capable and personally remote, and when Bette was 7 years old, he left the family. Not quietly, not gradually, simply left. Ruth Davis was left to raise 2 daughters on whatever combination of work and ingenuity she could assemble, and she did it with a specific and sustaining refusal to be defeated by circumstances that would have broken many people. She worked as a house mother, as a photographer, as whatever the situation required. She moved the family through a series of small New England towns. She made things work. Bette absorbed this. The specific quality of ferocious self-sufficiency and refusal to accept defeat as a permanent condition, the thing that would make her both extraordinary to watch and genuinely difficult to live with, came directly from the mother who had demonstrated it every day of her childhood. Ruthie Davis, as she was known, became Bette's closest companion and most consistent champion, accompanying her to New York when Bette decided she was going to become an actress, attending her film openings, sharing the chaos of her early career. They were, by every account of people who knew them, unusually close in the way that mothers and daughters become close when they have survived difficult things together. Bette wanted to act from the time she was in her early teens. She attended the John Murray Anderson School for the Dramatic Arts in New York and studied with private teachers. She made her professional stage debut in 1928 in a stock company production, and her Broadway debut in 1929 in a play called Broken Dishes. In 1930, she came to Hollywood, not because Hollywood was what she wanted most, but because Hollywood was where the work was and she needed work, and that pragmatic decision transformed American cinema. Universal signed her first, then dropped her after deciding she had nothing that would make her a star. She went to Warner Brothers, where she would spend the defining years of her career. The early Warner Brothers films gave her small parts in productions that were not designed to show her particular qualities. She was frustrated. The frustration was productive, in the way that it is for people who convert thwarted ambition into intense professional effort. Her performance in Of Human Bondage in 1934, a RKO production in which she was loaned out from Warner Brothers to play the manipulative waitress Mildred Rogers alongside Leslie Howard, was the performance that established her as a serious actress and began the conversation about her that has not stopped since. The Academy did not nominate her for it, a snub that generated enough public controversy that the Academy changed its nomination rules to allow write-in votes for that year's ceremony. She was nominated the following year for Dangerous and won her first Academy Award. She won again for Jezebel in 1939. But by then, she was already married to the first of the four men who would try to fit alongside the life she was building, with varying degrees of success and disastrous failure. Ham Nelson, the husband who divorced her for loving books. Harmon Oscar Nelson Jr., known to everyone as Ham, was Bette Davis's high school boyfriend from their years in Newton, Massachusetts. He was a musician, pleasant-looking, and possessed of the specific quality of easy companionship that high school sweethearts have when the relationship forms before either person fully understands who they are going to become. They had dated in their teens, gone in different directions, and then reconnected when he moved to California after she was already established at Warner Brothers, and the familiarity of their shared history reasserted itself with the comfortable pull of something known. They married on August 18th, 1932, in a quiet ceremony. Bette was 24. Ham was the kind of man who seemed like a reasonable choice for a young woman at the beginning of her career, when the career's full demands and the specific requirements of being Bette Davis were still becoming clear. He was familiar. He was safe. He was interested in her. He was not, as it turned out, capable of handling what she became. The first problem was the money. Bette Davis, by the mid-1930s, was earning amounts that few people in America, male or female, were earning. Warner Brothers eventually put her on a weekly salary of $10,000, making her the highest-paid woman in the United States. Ham Nelson, as a musician, was not earning anything like this. The specific dynamic of a wife who earns dramatically more than her husband is not unusual now and was not unheard of then. Plenty of Hollywood marriages contained this dynamic. But it required a particular quality of security from the husband to navigate without resentment. Ham did not have that security. He refused to allow Bette to purchase a house using her earnings until he could afford to pay for the house himself. This was not a negotiated position. It was a refusal based on the specific anxiety of a man who understood that the economic terms of his marriage were organized around his wife's success, and who responded to this by applying what control he could in the one area where assertion seemed available. Bette was making enough money to buy and maintain a significant property. She was not allowed to because of her husband's feelings about what it would mean for him if she did. The marriage strained through the years of her career's acceleration. She filmed Of Human Bondage. She won Oscar nominations and then won the Oscar itself. She fought with Warner Brothers over the quality of her scripts and the terms of her contract in ways that demonstrated the specific combination of ambition and principle that defined her professional life. She was becoming the most important actress in American film. And Ham, at home, watched, and read newspapers about his wife, and attended parties where the guests were interested in her, and managed whatever he managed. By 1937, Bette was having an affair with her The Great Lie co-star George Brent, who reportedly proposed to her and was declined. The marriage to Ham was deteriorating through the specific distance of two people who have stopped fully seeing each other, whether or not either of them was willing to name it. The year 1938 was, professionally, one of the most significant of Bette's entire career. She filmed Jezebel, the William Wyler-directed melodrama about a headstrong Southern woman who pays an enormous personal price for her pride, for which she would win her second Academy Award. The film was made while her marriage was in its final deterioration, and the specific quality of Jezebel's willfulness and the tragedy of its consequences has always had an autobiographical resonance for people who know what was happening in Bette's personal life at the time. She was playing a woman destroyed by her refusal to submit, while living the marriage of a woman determined not to. In 1938, Ham filed for divorce. The grounds he cited, and this is the detail that has followed every account of this marriage ever since, included Bette's excessive dedication to her career and her habit of reading her film manuscripts when he had guests present. He claimed they had lost the close communion of a married couple, and that her work was simply more important to her than the marriage. He also apparently had documented evidence of her relationship with Howard Hughes, which was included in the proceedings. Bette did not contest the divorce. She later said that other factors had contributed to the breakdown, a formulation that, in context, appears to acknowledge both the infidelities and the deeper incompatibility between who she was and what the marriage had been able to contain. She was 30 years old and free of a marriage that had never fit. What she did not have, at 30, with 2 Oscars already to her name and a career at its absolute peak, was anyone else. That changed when she went to New Hampshire. Arthur Farnsworth, the love who died mysteriously. In 1939, Bette Davis arrived at a lodge called the Sugar Hill Inn in Franconia, New Hampshire, seeking the specific rest that a woman at the top of her profession and in the immediate aftermath of a failed marriage sometimes needs. The kind of rest that requires actual distance from the industry and the city and the machinery of everything. Arthur Farnsworth was the assistant manager of the lodge. He was a dentist's son from New England, handsome in an unpretentious way, possessed of an easy sense of humor and a quality of calm attentiveness that was immediately distinct from the Hollywood world Bette inhabited. He had previously worked as a commercial airline pilot before moving into hospitality management. He was not intimidated by her fame. He was not trying to leverage their relationship into something that would benefit his career. He was simply a man in New Hampshire who found this particular woman interesting and said so. She was charmed immediately. The relationship developed across visits. She returned to New Hampshire. She invited him to California. The correspondence between visits sustained something that was building into something real. He was not a man of the industry. He did not want things from her that her position could provide. He appeared to want, simply, her, which was the specific combination of qualities that was most unusual in the world she inhabited, where almost everyone who approached her wanted something that her fame or her professional influence could deliver. What she described of Farnsworth in interviews and in her memoirs was someone of genuine ease, a man who was comfortable in his own life and therefore comfortable in hers, who did not find the discrepancy between her fame and his relative obscurity to be something that required compensation or management. He was proud of her in the simple and uncomplicated way that secure people are proud of the people they love. He made her laugh. He was interested in her as a person rather than as a phenomenon. These were not small things in the world she was navigating. By December 1940, they eloped. They were married on December 30th, 1940, at the Butolph House in Rimrock, Arizona, in a small private ceremony that reflected Bette's awareness that any large public wedding would become a spectacle she had no interest in managing. The marriage was, by the accounts of people who knew them together, the happiest domestic period of Bette Davis's adult life. Farnsworth was not threatened by her success. He was not in competition with her career. He supported her work with a genuine and uncomplicated enthusiasm that was entirely different from Ham Nelson's specific resentment or the various other entanglements her personal life had produced. He was someone she could come home to, the specific kind of anchor that extraordinary public lives require and rarely find. They had 3 years together. On August 23rd, 1943, Arthur Farnsworth collapsed on the corner of Hollywood Boulevard and Cahuenga Boulevard in the middle of the afternoon. He was walking along the sidewalk, in public, on a clear day. He fell without apparent warning and hit his head on the pavement. He was rushed to hospital. He never regained consciousness and died 2 days later, on August 25th, 1943. He was 35 years old. The cause of death was investigated and ultimately attributed to a basal skull fracture that had been sustained in a fall. A previous fall, apparently, that had produced a blood clot on the right side of his skull, whose symptoms had gone either unnoticed or unaddressed. The investigations into his death were not entirely conclusive about the exact circumstances of the earlier fall, and the questions raised were never fully answered. What was established was that the fracture that killed him had been there for some time, and that the collapse on Hollywood Boulevard was the final consequence of an injury that had been progressing quietly. Bette was at the hospital. She was, by the account of an archived Los Angeles Times report from the time, hysterical with grief and under a physician's care. She had an adjoining room at the hospital so she could be near him. She sat with his body after he died. She was 35 years old and widowed. She went back to work. She had to go back to work. The Warner Brothers contract required her presence, and beyond the contract, the work was the thing she had built her entire identity around. The thing that had persisted through Ham Nelson's resentment and was still there now that Arthur was gone. She made Mr. Skeffington in 1944, in which she played a beautiful woman whose vanity is tested by age and illness, and the eventual return of the husband she had treated carelessly in her youth. It is a film about what women lose when the primary currency they have been given, their appearance, is taken from them. And Bette played it with the specific ferocity of someone who understood what was being examined and did not flinch from it. She received another Academy Award nomination. She kept working. The grieving showed. The films she made in the immediate aftermath of Arthur's death have a specific quality that people who know the context of her life notice when they watch them. A rawness and an absence of the protective irony that she usually maintained. She threw herself into her work at Warner Brothers with the specific intensity of someone who is using work as the only available container for something too large to otherwise hold. And then, in 1945, she made the choice that people who knew her would later describe as the most inexplicable decision of her romantic life. William Grant Sherry, the worst of the four. William Grant Sherry was an artist. He was also, by the accounts of virtually everyone who knew the marriage from the inside, a man of considerable violence and considerable instability, and the marriage to him was the darkest chapter of Bette Davis's personal life. The question of why Bette Davis married William Grant Sherry, given what the marriage revealed almost immediately, is one that her friends and biographers have returned to repeatedly without fully resolving. Some have pointed to the specific vulnerability of her position in 1945. She was 37 years old, still grieving Arthur Farnsworth, operating in an industry that had specific and explicit ideas about the expiration date on female stars, and perhaps susceptible to the appeal of someone who seemed to exist entirely outside the machinery that was measuring her. Sherry was 6 years younger than she was, and had the kind of physical attractiveness that the early stages of attraction can make very significant. He was an outsider to Hollywood in the way that Farnsworth had been an outsider to Hollywood. But where Farnsworth's outsider status had been genuine, rooted in a life that was simply elsewhere. Sherry's outsider status was in retrospect more the absence of success than the presence of an alternative. The courtship was brief. The marriage was immediate. And the marriage was, almost from its beginning, something that required managing rather than inhabiting. She met him in 1945, 2 years after Arthur Farnsworth's death. He was 6 years younger than she was, physically striking, and entirely outside the Hollywood world that she had inhabited for 15 years. He painted. He seemed, at first encounter, like someone whose life was organized around different principles than the industry's. A man who existed in relation to his creative work rather than to box office numbers and studio politics. After the specific tragedy of Arthur's death and the years of professional isolation that followed, someone who existed entirely outside the machinery of Hollywood had its particular appeal. They married on November 29th, 1945. Almost immediately, by the accounts available, the marriage revealed itself to be something very different from what the courtship had suggested. Sherry was physically abusive toward Davis from early in the marriage. The abuse was not a secret within the social circles they moved in. It was known, discussed, witnessed in its aftermath, if not always directly. He had a violent temper and a specific pattern of targeting Bette in physical ways that left her in fear for both her own safety and, increasingly, the safety of their daughter. Their daughter, Barbara Davis Sherry, called BD by everyone, and who would grow up to become one of the more significant complications of Bette Davis's later life, was born in 1947. Bette threw herself into motherhood with the specific intensity she brought to everything, and in her memoirs, she described becoming so absorbed in the reality of having a child that she considered leaving film entirely to focus on being a mother. She was genuinely astonished by what being a parent felt like, and genuinely conflicted about how to balance it with a career that was also making demands that could not simply be paused. But the marriage was deteriorating rapidly. Sherry's outbursts worsened. There were scenes on her film sets. He appeared, he made his displeasure with various things known, he created the specific chaotic atmosphere of an abusive man who cannot contain his behavior even in contexts where the stakes of containing it are enormous. Bette began to fear for BD's safety as well as her own. She also became aware. This detail has the particular quality of a bad novel, but is part of the documented record, that Sherry was sleeping with the woman she had hired as BD's nanny. She left. She filed for divorce. The settlement she agreed to included a provision that should be understood in context. She offered to pay Sherry alimony on the condition that he stay away from her and from BD. She was so determined to be free of him and so concerned about the specific danger he represented that she was willing to pay money to guarantee the distance. The divorce was finalized on July 3rd, 1950. Sherry, once the divorce was done, married the nanny, Marion Richards, the woman he had been seeing while still married to Bette. He and Marion remained married until his death in 2003. Bette was alone. Her career, by 1950, was struggling. The Warner Brothers years were ending, the film offers were drying up, and Hollywood insiders were beginning to say the things they say about women whose careers have peaked and who have become too difficult and too expensive and too associated with a particular era to remain bankable in the next one. She was 42 years old, divorced from a violent man, with a 3-year-old daughter, and a career that was suddenly very uncertain. What happened next changed everything. All About Eve and the Last Husband. In 1950, Claudette Colbert injured her back and had to withdraw from a film she had committed to, a Joseph L. Mankiewicz production for 20th Century Fox called All About Eve. Darryl Zanuck, who was producing, needed a replacement quickly. The script was one of the most distinguished in recent Hollywood memory, a layered, witty, devastating examination of ambition and displacement, and the specific cruelty that the entertainment world directs toward women as they age out of the category of young. It required an actress who could hold enormous intelligence and enormous vulnerability simultaneously, who could play a woman who is both genuinely magnificent and genuinely frightened, who could make an audience understand why such a woman might be her own worst enemy. Bette Davis read the script. She described it as the best script she had ever read. This from a woman who had read thousands of scripts across 20 years and had strong opinions about all of them. She accepted the role within days and joined the production in San Francisco. Joseph L. Mankiewicz later said that she was letter perfect in the role, that she arrived with the character fully formed, that directing her required only the freedom she gave herself to inhabit Margot Channing completely. All About Eve would eventually receive 14 Academy Award nominations, a record at the time that has never been equaled. It would win 6. Bette Davis would receive her 8th Academy Award nomination for it. The film is still considered one of the greatest in the history of American cinema, and during production, she fell in love with her leading man. Based on a story about a celebrated stage actress who is slowly, systematically displaced by the ambitions of a younger woman she has befriended. The character's name was Margot Channing. The role required an actress who understood what it meant to be a woman of exceptional talent navigating the specific anxiety of aging in a world that had loved her when she was young. Bette Davis read the script. She described it as the best script she had ever read. She accepted the role within days and joined the production in San Francisco. All About Eve would eventually receive 14 Academy Award nominations, a record at the time. It would win 6. Bette Davis would receive her 8th Academy Award nomination for it. The film is still considered one of the greatest in the history of American cinema. And during production, she fell in love with her leading man. Gary Merrill was an actor, not a movie star on Bette's level, not a figure of her particular magnitude, but a working actor of genuine ability and considerable personal magnetism. He played Bill Simpson, the fiancé whom the scheming Eve attempts to seduce away from Margot. In the film, he remained loyal. In life, he fell in love with the woman he was performing loyalty toward. Their attraction during filming was immediate and total. They were spending their days performing the specific intimacy of people in love. The script required it. And the performance became reality in the way that film sets sometimes allow, in the specific pressure cooker atmosphere of a production where the material is excellent and the people making it know they are doing something that matters. Merrill's divorce from his first wife, Barbara Leeds, was finalized on July 28, 1950. Bette's divorce from William Grant Sherry had been finalized 25 days earlier. On July 28, 1950, the same day Merrill's first divorce was final, he and Bette Davis were married. The speed was deliberate, and the speed was characteristic. Bette Davis was not someone who waited when she knew what she wanted. The marriage began with what appeared to be an extraordinary foundation. They were two actors who had made one of the best films of the decade together. They were both people of passion and strong opinions, and the kind of determined self-sufficiency that the acting profession cultivates in the people who survive it over decades. They had 3 children between them. B.D. from Bette's previous marriage, and Margot and Michael, whom they adopted together. They had a home on the coast of Maine that was beautiful and remote, and as far as possible from Hollywood, while still being reachable when the work required it. Director Joseph L. Mankiewicz observed that both Davis and Merrill seemed to have confused themselves with the characters they played in All About Eve, that Bette had become, in some fundamental way, Margot Channing, and that Merrill had become Bill Simpson, Margot's devoted younger partner. The characters were designed for the screen. The screen versions worked better than the real ones. The main years, the early years of the marriage, when the children were small and the coast was present and the film industry was a train ride away, were, by various accounts, genuinely good in ways that the later years were not. Bette has written about finding in motherhood something that surprised her with its completeness, something that the career had never quite delivered in the same way. The specific grounded reality of small children who need you in the immediate, physical sense, and who receive your attention with an uncalculating gratitude that the film industry never provided. She set aside significant portions of her career in the early 1950s to be present for the children, and the decision cost her professionally and ultimately did not produce what she had hoped for from the marriage. The marriage began with what appeared to be an extraordinary foundation. The film that brought them together was receiving the most significant acclaim of Bette's career, a comeback of the most visible and most complete kind. Merrill adopted B.D., Bette's daughter, from the Sherry marriage with Sherry's consent. In January 1951, they adopted a daughter they named Margot, after Margot Channing, the character Bette had played. In 1952, they adopted a son named Michael. They moved to a coastal estate in Cape Elizabeth, Maine, and attempted to build the specific domestic life that Bette had always wanted and had never quite managed to sustain. What the marriage revealed over the following decade was that two people who are both capable of enormous passion and enormous volatility do not necessarily create stability when they combine those qualities. They create heat and light, and the specific kind of turbulence that produces good stories and considerable damage. Merrill had his own relationship with alcohol that worsened over the years of the marriage. He was physically volatile in ways that, while not precisely the same as Sherry's violence, produced a domestic atmosphere that was frequently frightening and frequently chaotic. Bette goaded. Merrill escalated. The specific dynamic of two people who are both stubborn and both capable of explosion, living together with children and with the additional pressure of careers that were not developing on parallel tracks, his declining steadily while hers remained significant, created something that wore them both down in ways that the 10 years together documented clearly. Merrill wrote an autobiography late in his life that he titled Bette, Rita, and the Rest of My Life, naming Davis and Rita Hayworth, his two most famous romantic attachments, as the defining experiences. In it, he acknowledged that he lacked the driving professional ambition that Davis possessed, describing himself as someone who was satisfied to get by and have fun, which was its own kind of self-knowledge and also a precise description of what made the marriage difficult. He was with a woman for whom getting by was never the aspiration. Bette filed for divorce in 1960, citing his alcoholism and the abusive behavior that had developed across the 10 years. She said, in later interviews, that for the first 3 years of the marriage she had set aside her career to focus on being a wife and mother, and that during those years, Gary had fallen out of love with her. It is a statement of striking vulnerability from a woman not generally associated with public vulnerability, that she had sacrificed the career that had always been the central fact of her life, and that the sacrifice had not been enough. The divorce was finalized in 1960. They remained, as former spouses in Hollywood often do, in complicated, ongoing contact through the children they had adopted together. Merrill defended Bette publicly when B.D. Hyman published a damaging memoir about her mother in 1985, calling the book motivated by cruelty and greed. He died in 1990, a year after Bette Davis. B.D. Hyman, The Children, and What the Marriages Left. The 4 marriages produced 3 children, B.D. from the Sherry marriage and Margot and Michael from the Merrill marriage. The story of what Bette Davis was as a mother is the subject of considerable controversy, organized primarily around the memoir that B.D. Hyman published in 1985 called My Mother's Keeper, a book that painted Bette Davis as a difficult, demanding, and often destructive parent whose behavior toward her daughter had been damaging across decades. Davis was devastated by the book. Friends of hers who had known the family pointed out that much of what B.D. described was out of context or inaccurate. And when Mike Wallace rebroadcast an old 60 Minutes interview in which B.D. had commended her mother's parenting and described adopting Bette's principles for her own children, the gap between B.D.'s account and the documented record became visible. Critics of BD's narrative also noted that Bette Davis had financially supported the Hyman family for years, including apparently helping them avoid losing their home in the period immediately before the memoir's publication. Margot Merrill, adopted as an infant, was eventually diagnosed with developmental disabilities and was placed in a residential care facility where she lived for most of her adult life. She died in 2022 at the age of 71. Michael Merrill became a producer and was the child who maintained the closest relationship with Bette in her later years, ending contact with B.D. Hyman over her treatment of their mother. Bette Davis continued working. The resilience that she had learned from watching her mother navigate abandonment and poverty was a quality she applied to the professional as well as the personal, and the career that continued after the Gary Merrill divorce included Whatever Happened to Baby Jane in 1962, a film made with Joan Crawford that was itself a study in what extraordinary and difficult women look like when the industry has largely stopped knowing what to do with them, and a body of television and film work that continued into the 1980s, long past the point where anyone expected it. She had a stroke in 1983 that left her with partial paralysis on one side of her face and required significant physical rehabilitation. She underwent the rehabilitation with the specific disciplined ferocity she brought to everything. She was diagnosed with breast cancer and underwent a mastectomy. She continued to make public appearances. She continued to take roles. She gave interviews and attended industry events and received honorary awards and gave speeches that were, by every account, as sharp and as characteristic of the woman she had always been as anything she had done in her prime. When she received the AFI Life Achievement Award in 1977, becoming the first woman to receive the honor, the ceremony was attended by virtually everyone significant in American film, and the accounts of the evening describe something approaching reverence, the specific quality of recognition that an entire industry gives to someone who has not simply made good films, but has fought consistently for the terms under which good films get made, and the terms under which women in the industry are treated as serious professionals rather than decorative objects. She was not comfortable receiving reverence. She was more comfortable giving opinions. She had a stroke in 1983. She was diagnosed with breast cancer. She recovered from the stroke and from the mastectomy and kept working. She said, in the specific way of someone who has been shaped by a mother who did not stop, that she refused to be an invalid or to behave as though the illness was going to define the remaining chapter of her life. She died on October 6, 1989, in Neuilly-sur-Seine, France, while traveling, having attended a film festival in San Sebastian, Spain, where she had received a Lifetime Achievement Award and had given remarks that people who were present described as completely characteristic of her: direct, funny, uninterested in sentiment, aware of exactly what she had accomplished and unwilling to pretend otherwise. She died on the way home. She was 81 years old. She was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills, California, with a headstone that reads, "She did it the hard way," an epitaph that she had chosen herself, and that is, in the context of everything the four marriages contained, as precise and as honest an accounting of a life as any headstone in Hollywood. What four marriages say about one life. Looking at the four marriages together, the through line is not difficult to see. Bette Davis spent her adult life choosing men who offered different versions of the same impossible equation. Men who were attracted to her power and intelligence, and then, in various ways and with various degrees of damage, unable to sustain a relationship with those qualities when they encountered them daily. Ham Nelson was the comfortable choice who became the resentful one, who could not accept the specific terms of being married to a woman whose success had outpaced his own, and who chose to divorce her rather than adapt to what her life had become. Arthur Farnsworth was the real love. the one who seemed to offer the specific combination of stability and genuine partnership that the others could not provide, and who died at 35 in a way that left questions unanswered and a grief that Bette never fully set aside. William Grant Sherry was the catastrophic choice, the one whose violence and infidelity constituted the specific danger that required the most decisive and most costly departure, the marriage that illuminated what the absence of proper care looks like in its most extreme form. Gary Merrill was the last and the longest, the man who came to her at the moment of her greatest professional triumph, who began the relationship in the specific glow of All About Eve and the comeback it represented, and who ultimately proved to be someone whose demons and whose limitations were equal to her own, producing a decade of combustion rather than the partnership she needed. She never married a fifth time. She was asked, in various interviews in her later years, whether she regretted the marriages, and her answers were characteristically direct and characteristically complicated, acknowledging the damage without condemning herself for the choices, naming what each man had offered and what each had ultimately cost, maintaining the specific quality of clear-eyed self-assessment that had always been one of her most distinctive qualities, both on screen and off. She said, at various points in her life, that she was not an easy woman to be married to. She was right. She was also not a woman who was willing to make herself smaller in order to fit comfortably inside a marriage designed for someone less than she was, and the 4 marriages documented in sequence are the record of what that refusal produced: the damage, the grief, the children, and the remarkable life that continued regardless. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.